Well, good morning and welcome back to the shop. So before I get started putting the engine together, I wanted to take a quick look at what I had done yesterday on the previous video with this whole reassigning the pivot point and allowing now the clutch fork to be assembled. I realized that the clutch fork was not allowing the throwout bearing to travel all the way down the input shaft. In fact, I wanted that throwout bearing to go all the way to the back of the input shaft, almost touching the transmission. And in fact, there was about an inch left. And the reason behind that is the original spacer block that they provide is 1 inch thick originally. The thing is that being 1 inch thick, it was holding the pivot point further away from the transmission, which means the clutch fork was further away from the transmission, which means when the clutch fork swang out, it hit the bell housing and it was stopping the throwout bearing from traveling further down the input shaft. So what did I have to do? I had to cut this, so now that it's 0.7. So I've removed 30% of the thickness of the spacer block. Now that 30% of the thickness now allows the spacer block to go further back, which means the pivot point is further back, which means the clutch fork is further back, which now gives it the clearance that when the clutch fork swings forward, it makes contact with the bell housing, yes, but right at the time it makes contact with the bell housing, the throwout bearing is making contact with the back of the transmission, or right along the input shaft. Well, nobody likes to do things twice. And here I am sitting back where I was yesterday when I did the other video, but we needed to do this because now what I've got is I've got a throwout bearing that is all the way down the end of the input shaft. It is contacting the transmission. It can't go further back, which is perfect. We need that clearance. We have to make sure that we can adjust by using the rod. We can adjust moving the throwout bearing forward. And once it's all assembled, we will make that adjustment on the rod, which will bring this close but not in contact with the clutch. So what will happen is we'll adjust the nut, which will bring this forward until we contact, and then we back it off just a little bit, right? So that the throwout bearing is never sitting in contact with the clutch, or you'll burn that throwout bearing out in a week or a month. So we got to make sure that that is clear. But the good news now is by moving that pivot point back, this has now all the way back. This just is shy of hitting, which is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. So sorry for the step back in time. Let's get onto that motor, but keep that in mind. Make sure if you're doing this and you're at this point that throwout bearing is as far back as it possibly can be, or it will cause problems. Okay, so I'm going to put all the parts back onto this motor. As you can see, I have the rest of the kit here. Obviously, all the rest of the gaskets are already on the engine. But before I get started, what I like to do is I like to print off all the torque specs, right? Because intake manifold, timing chain cover, etc., etc. I have some blue Permatex on the thread lock. I have some red. I have some red RTV. Now, some people like the gray, some people like the black. I like the red only because it's a little higher temperature it can manage. And of course all the gaskets that I'm going to need to put this together. And of course the other stuff is the oil pump, water pump, timing chain cover, harmonic balancer, some of the brackets. Now the reason I've got the brackets prepped is some of the bolts that you use are actually the bolts that go onto the water pump. So you have to be ready to install the bracketry as well. And then finally, of course, the motor. Okay, don't worry. We're not going to sit here for the next 2 hours while you watch me put gaskets on a car engine. I mean, you can see that everywhere. And as I've always said about my channel, if you can see it someplace else, I'm not going to repeat it here. But there is something that we do have to talk about before we put anything on this engine, and that is the timing chain cover. The reasoning is, this is the original block, right? It's a 1968 numbers matching block to my car, so I wanted to keep that. But now we wanted to put modern components into this engine, right? So we have a modern camshaft in this engine. Of course, we have more lift, more duration. We have larger pistons. Obviously, we had to go 30 over because we needed to bore the engine out in order to straighten out the cylinders. But at the same time, we add a little bit of compression to the engine as well. So we wanted to make sure that all of those clearances and tolerances stay where they have to be. And to do that, we went with a double roller timing chain. That way there we're not going to get as, as much stretch in the chain. So all of the settings that we have are going to stay that way for many, 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 many miles. There is a problem though. When you go to a double roller timing chain on these older engines and you also want to run a mechanical fuel pump and you have the pump eccentric, this has actually shifted out about 30,000th of an inch. The double roller timing chain is wider than a single roller timing chain. Go figure. But basically it pushes everything forward by about 20, maybe 25,000th of an inch. So now what you have to do before you do anything is you take your timing chain cover and you place it on and you see whether or not your timing chain cover contacts your block. If it does, then your clearance is okay. If it starts to wobble or teeter, then obviously it's teetering on the eccentric and you have to do something about it. Well, I had to do something about it. In my case, when I did that experiment a day ago, it teetered. It was not contacting the block. What did I have to do? I had to remove the eccentric and I had to take about 25,000th of an inch off the face of the eccentric. Now don't worry, everything is moved forward by that 25,000th of an inch. Therefore, the rod for my mechanical pump is still going to ride on the eccentric right dead center because I just moved it forward, no problems, but it wouldn't go together. So now if you take a look, you can see I have clearance between the eccentric and the front of the cam cover, and of course, or the timing chain cover, and of course I'm going to also put a gasket on, which will even give me a little bit more clearance. But I like the clearance to be there without it, because the last thing we want to have is any contact inside. So, through the magic of internet, let's take this engine and turn it into this. Well, about 3 hours it took to put the engine all together. The good news, no broken bolts, no lost bolts, so it went together actually quite easy. The only challenge you run into is the water pump. I mean, the water pump, you've got like 4 gaskets between the engine and the water pump, so that was a bit of a pain in the butt. But if you want to see how to change a water pump, I mean, there's 1,000 videos. That's not, I didn't want to do that here and have you sit and watch me do that for 3 hours. But some words of advice is that I did put the brackets on for the power steering and the alternator. The reason I do that is the bolts I mentioned earlier, these bolts that come with the brackets are also part of the bolts that tighten down the water pump and make sure nothing leaks. The bracket itself is about a 1/4 inch thick piece of steel. If you don't put the bracket on and you put the bolt in, the bolt might actually bottom out before it tightens. And that's because the tolerances are actually quite close on these things. So if you are not going to put the bracket on, at least put some washers on the bolt. And that way there to keep the bolt out a bit, because if it bottoms, you're going to think you're tight, but in fact you're not, and then you're going to have leaks everywhere. So intake manifold is on. As you can see, it is a 4-barrel intake manifold, right? This was a 289 C code car, but since we've stepped on the compression and we've stepped on the lift and we've stepped on the duration, we wanted to make sure that it had enough fuel to keep it happy, and that's where we got the 4-barrel is on it now. And like I said, so that's all together. Everything seemed to be fine. So what is the next step? So what I want to do is take this off of the engine stand now, and I might have to build something that the engine can sit on, because the next thing we want to do is put on the spacer plate, the flywheel, the clutch, the bell housing. So there's a couple things that we need to do to make sure everything's good. I might have to do a dial indicator to make sure that the bell housing is true to the output shaft, right? Because you don't want that to be offset. I'm also going to have to make sure that that whole distance between the throwout bearing and the clutch diaphragm is good as well. So we want to do all of that while it's not in the car. So I'm going to have to build something that we can then play with this, put it all together, do some testing. So for that kind of stuff, I'm absolutely going to record all of the steps on that, because that's kind of unique, right? We are converting this from a automatic to a manual, and at the same time, we're going from an old transmission to obviously a T5, and we've had to modify the bell housing. So there's a few things that we've done differently, so I'll record all of that. But until that time, thanks for watching, and hit that like button, and let's see what kind of trouble I can get into later on this week. I'll talk to you then.